Canada's recent response to U.S. trade pressure has exposed an often ignored reality of modern geopolitics. Economic power does not always flow in the direction policymakers expect. What began as a tariff strategy aimed at protecting American industries has instead evolved into a symbolic and economic setback, one that has reshaped public perception, strained cross-border relations, and challenged long-standing political narratives. At the center of this unfolding situation is an unexpected symbol: American bourbon. Bourbon is more than just a drink. It represents a deeply rooted American industry, particularly concentrated in states like Kentucky and Tennessee. For decades, it has been marketed internationally as a premium American export, tied closely to U.S. identity, craftsmanship, and cultural influence. When trade tensions escalated between the United States and Canada, bourbon quickly became collateral damage. The renewed U.S. tariff push under President Donald Trump targeted multiple Canadian goods, framed publicly as a necessary step to correct trade imbalances and protect domestic manufacturing. From the administration's perspective, tariffs were a tool of leverage, meant to pressure Canada into economic concessions while reinforcing the America First doctrine. However, Canada's response took a different path than traditional diplomatic retaliation. Rather than escalating tariffs across the board or engaging in prolonged negotiations, Canada leveraged consumer behavior. Provincial liquor boards began removing American spirits from shelves. Retailers promoted Canadian alternatives. Social media campaigns encouraged citizens to buy Canadian and reject U.S. products associated with the trade dispute. This was not an official declaration of economic war, but it was highly effective. The result was swift. American bourbon exports to Canada dropped sharply. Distillers reported canceled orders, delayed shipments, and sudden uncertainty in what had long been considered a stable and friendly export market. For an industry already facing global competition and rising production costs, the Canadian pullback hit hard. This reaction revealed something critical. Trade wars are no longer confined to government negotiations. In the modern era, public sentiment can amplify or neutralize state power. Canada's response transformed a policy dispute into a cultural statement, reframing the conflict in the eyes of international observers. For the Trump administration, the optics were problematic. The narrative of strength and economic dominance began to clash with images of American products being publicly rejected by one of the country's closest allies. Instead of showcasing leverage, the tariffs appeared to provoke unity and resistance north of the border. The bourbon industry's plight also highlighted the uneven impact of trade policy within the United States. While tariffs are often discussed in macroeconomic terms, their effects are deeply localized. Small and mid-sized distilleries, many of them family-owned, suddenly found themselves exposed to geopolitical decisions made far from their operations. Expansion plans were paused, hiring slowed, long-term export strategies were thrown into doubt. From Canada's perspective, the move was strategic. By targeting culturally symbolic products rather than essential goods, the country avoided major domestic disruption while maximizing political impact. Bourbon was chosen not because it was economically critical to Canada, but because it mattered politically in the United States. This tactic falls under what analysts describe as soft economic resistance. It does not rely on military force or sweeping sanctions. Instead, it leverages visibility, symbolism, and public participation. In an interconnected global economy, these tools can be remarkably powerful. The episode also underscores the limits of unilateral economic pressure in a world of interdependence. The US and Canada share one of the largest trading relationships on Earth, with supply chains deeply integrated across industries. When one side applies pressure, the effects inevitably echo back. In this case, the echo was political rather than purely financial. Public discourse in Canada framed the boycott as a defense of sovereignty and fairness. In the United States, reactions were mixed. Supporters of the tariff policy argued that short-term pain was necessary to secure long-term gains. Critics countered that alienating allies weakened America's global standing and undermined industries that depended on open markets. What makes this situation particularly significant is how quickly the narrative shifted. The initial framing emphasized assertiveness. Within weeks, the conversation evolved into questions of miscalculation, unintended consequences, and reputational damage. The focus moved away from trade deficits and towards diplomacy and credibility. Internationally, other countries took note. Allies observed that resistance did not require confrontation, it required coordination and messaging. Adversaries saw evidence that economic nationalism can create vulnerabilities. For smaller and mid-sized nations, Canada's approach became a case study in asymmetric response. This moment also reflects a broader trend in geopolitics, the growing role of consumers as political actors. Purchasing decisions once considered apolitical now function as expressions of national identity and policy preference. Governments may set the stage, but citizens increasingly influence outcomes. The bourbon collapse narrative resonates because it humanizes abstract policy. It translates tariffs into real-world consequences, empty shelves, lost contracts, and strained relationships. It also challenges the assumption that economic pressure flows only from larger economies to smaller ones. For President Trump, the situation complicates messaging. While the administration continues to frame tariffs as a tool of strength, this episode demonstrates that strength is not measured solely by imposition, but by outcomes. When a policy provokes unity among allies against American interests, its effectiveness comes into question. Looking ahead, the long-term impact remains uncertain. Some damage may be reversible through negotiation and policy adjustment. However, trust, once strained, is difficult to fully restore. Businesses plan based on predictability, and episodes like this introduce hesitation into future partnerships. More broadly, the incident reinforces a key lesson of 21st century geopolitics. Power is multidimensional. Military capability, economic size, and political influence matter, but so do perception, legitimacy, and cultural resonance. Losing ground in any one area can weaken the whole. The bourbon boycott may not redefine global trade, but it has already reshaped a narrative. It has shown that even symbolic actions can generate tangible consequences, and it has reminded policymakers that in a connected world, pressure is rarely one-directional. Ultimately, this episode is not about alcohol. It's about leverage, messaging, and the evolving nature of international influence. It illustrates how quickly a strategy designed to project dominance can be reframed as vulnerability, and how allies, through coordination and restraint, can alter the balance of perception. In modern geopolitics, the battlefield is no longer limited to borders or boardrooms. It exists in markets, media, and everyday choices. Canada's response demonstrated that clearly, and the reverberations of that response continue to shape the conversation around trade, power, and narrative control.